and that is Professor Shah Mahmoud Hanifi. So actually, the next two presentations are on Afghanistan. And so we're delighted to have with us Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, who is a professor of history at James Madison University in Virginia, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and South Asia. Professor Hanifi's research and publications have addressed subjects including colonial political economy, the Pashto language, photography, cartography, animal and environmental studies, and Orientalism in Afghanistan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Hanifi.
Thank you very much, Professor Khalil, and I'd like to express my thanks not only to you, but Professor Chandra, Mary, all the administrators and units at MSU who make the Muslim Studies program go. It's a real pleasure to participate in this longstanding conference. It's a special privilege to share the stage with my father. And I'll try to share my screen if I can, please. And what my intent here is to give you a long-term view of water in Afghanistan, a kind of longue durée approach, maybe 5,000 years of water history in 15 minutes. So I should say at the beginning that I'm a recent migrant to environmental studies. I was a traditional historian working on things like political economy, but got interested in animals, particularly camels, and through a study of animals, I became truly interested in the environmental history of Afghanistan, which I'm now trying to organize a book that will have chapters dealing with water, forests, animals, and food. So I am looking forward to the publication associated, if we get that off the ground, to kind of get a rough draft of the water component of that book. So I'll be moving through a lot of images and a lot of time. I hope to make a couple of connections to some papers yesterday. Natana DeLong Boss's paper, of course, dealing with water. Dr. Van Wieren's discussion of agriculture. Jonathan Brockup's climate change, I guess, will all possible connections for discussions to pursue in that way. I do want to mention that I'm very proud to say I have a lineage to MSU. My father was sent to MSU in 1956, where he met my mother, a Lebanese Arab Michigan. So I have a Spartan lineage. But like Mohammed, I went to the University of Michigan, so I guess we have both blue and green blood coursing through our veins somehow. In any event, what I'm going to focus on here are rivers, and primarily the Indus River, the Oxus River, and the Helmand River, none of which are visible here. But I do want to note it's impossible to separate rivers from mountains, from forests, from people, from animals. And what is most important initially to recognize about Afghanistan is that it draws upon the cultures and the technologies and the civilizational resources of both Iran and India. And I want to offer what may be a hypothesis, at least for the ancient period, regarding that interstitial relationship. And that is, it appears at first glance, at least, that Afghanistan has taken a deep ancient history of overground water storage tanks, reservoirs, cisterns from South Asia, and underground water movement through underground channels we'll discuss from Iran. And this evidence comes from both ancient textual history, the Avesta, associated with Zoroastrianism, which becomes the state religion of Iran for a number of centuries. And on the one hand, and then the Rig Veda and other Sanskrit texts like the Mahabharata for South Asia, on the other hand, Additionally, there's a lot of archaeological evidence that comes to bear on the ancient period. And we'll talk about that in just a second. What's important about Afghanistan's rivers is that they are multiple and complex and are, in a sense, reducible to 5 different river basins, each contributing to a very diverse ecological setting in Afghanistan. It's most important to note that the Kabul River is a part of the Indus River Basin, which brings to eastern Afghanistan the monsoon effect. And it's very important to recognize that ecological framework. So beginning from South Asia, we can say that Afghanistan's rivers come onto the historical map through the Indus Valley civilization from about 2500 to 1900 BC. And subsequently, with Sanskrit texts, we also get a good deal of cultural attention to rivers in Afghanistan. And I'll just leave that statement to stand on its own for a while. Turning to Iran, what we have is the contribution of an underground irrigation system, the Qanat system, that has had a significant effect on Afghanistan's water supply in so many different ways. And what's important about the Qanat or Karez system is that it was developed in Iran and really exported globally, particularly through the Islamic centuries, indeed to China and the Americas. So this is a very significant hydraulic technology for Afghanistan that's very labor intensive. These underground canals are multiple miles long. Some are extremely large, others quite small. They require a lot of communal organization to stay clean and kind of dredged. From the air, they look particularly impressive for their scope and perhaps a satellite view gives us a sense. This is the alluvial fan in northern Afghanistan near the Oxus River that really does highlight how the Karez system has driven agricultural production in Afghanistan for millennia. And I would like to just reference that in broad measure, we have between 5,000 and 10,000 Karez network channels in the Helmand province alone in Afghanistan. These are under great threat by a number of reasons. First, wells, but also warfare. And we'll get to that subsequently here. I'd like to skip to the imperial era now and sort of moving quickly through the Islamic period. I would like to just highlight that Islam gets to Afghanistan in many ways around 1,000 years ago. And the minaret of Jam here is a marker of Islam's presence in Afghanistan. And I would like to draw attention to the role of basically water and architecture in medieval and early modern Islamic urban settings primarily that we don't have time to discuss on the one hand, as well as the artistic attention to water. Here we have a fountain in a court setting from the Shahnameh. And so what we have is a good deal of artistic and architectural developments around water in the early modern and medieval periods of Islamic history involving Afghanistan. Most significantly, though, is the founder of the Mughal Empire, Babur. And Babur made his name in Kabul, in and around Kabul, where he essentially fell in love with the very diverse climate around Kabul and did a lot of spent a lot of time there and did a lot of work, particularly with gardens and irrigation canals. This is one of the most famous types of Islamic gardens, the Chahar Bagh, that he developed in and around his own grave. Actually, Babur is buried in Kabul. And I just want to emphasize that his memoirs, Babur Nama, contain such a tremendous variety of information about the rivers of Afghanistan, about rafting, irrigation canals, fish, riparian environments, trees, plants, and the Babur Nama has been illuminated with a lot of drawings that give us a sense of how wonderfully attentive Babur was to the water channels and water in Afghanistan. Moving to the colonial era as an imperial formation, it's important to note that the British were lured to Afghanistan by the Indus River, and early mapping here of the Indus River on the left occurs in the early 19th century. And the British essentially culminated their mapping of Afghanistan with the Oxus River in the late 19th century. The map on the right is a Russian map of the Amu Darya River and its basin. And this is to draw attention to Russian and Soviet involvements as an imperial formation in Afghanistan, as well as the British. It's important to note that the first army of occupation in Afghanistan was called the Army of the Indus, to really highlight how important the Indus was for commercial and strategic reasoning for the British involving Afghanistan. Primarily in South Asia, Afghanistan was not fully colonized, so it was not subject to the intense hydraulic engineering and technologies that the British brought to bear, particularly in the Punjab region of North India, where a whole series of integrated new dams, dikes, canals, settlements, roads, bridges, all for, again, cash cropping, particularly cotton, that has a great impact for British colonialism. Moving to the national period of Afghanistan's water history, I'd like to draw attention to one dam project began in the 1920s in a province south of Kabul, Logar, where a dam was initiated in the 1920s, the Band-e-Sorkhab. And indeed, my grandfather was the first supervisor of that dam in conjunction with the Germans. And it's in that context that my grandfather met and married my grandmother, and my father will pick up the story of that union insofar as it brings my father's discussion of water in Kabul to bear on this conference. The Americans get involved in the water supply of Afghanistan intensively during the Cold War through the Helmand Valley Development Project, which really is reminiscent of the British colonial activities, the canal colonies of the Punjab. We have a historical comparison here. And similarly, it's not just large dams, these are hydroelectric dams, a series of them built in the southern region of Afghanistan with connecting roads, canals, agricultural settlements, cash cropping, the same kind of approach the British took on a higher, more intense scale. And this was a scientific failure. It led to a hypersalinization of the soil and ultimately resulted in the opium economy in many ways that we see associated with Afghanistan's more contemporary period, traceable to the Helmand Valley project. And again, we get a larger sense of the scale of these industrial projects. I would like very quickly to focus on the Kabul River that is first photographed in the late 19th century by the British in the context of the Second Anglo-Afghan War, basically 1880. Is the first photo of the Kabul River I can find for you. But I want to take you through a series of photographs of the Kabul River from the 1970s to today, where we see an increasing sort of transformation from what can be seen on a set of physical properties as a transformation from clean to dirty water. But it's important to note that clean and dirty water are cultural constructs, and it's the cultural conditioning of water, again, that my father will pick up. 1970s, Kabul River flowing and a relatively clean. 1980s, certainly not as flowing, it's a different season here, but still sort of usable for washing and cooking, was never for drinking. 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, and more contemporary. And what we see is a sort of metaphor for Afghanistan more generally concerning pollution, that is air and water pollution over the last, let's say, generation in Afghanistan. Now, to close, I'd like to talk about the post-2001 period with the global war on terror, contextualized by profound climate change effects with sustained droughts and famines connected to deglaciation, which we can see glacier melt from 1917 to 18 here, a devastating effect on the water supply of Afghanistan, climate change induced, which brings, of course, climate change involves both increasing floods and droughts, and Afghanistan has been subject to both increasing floods in the contemporary period and increasing droughts as well. And of course, the post-2001 period is a period of active international warfare, as well as intense international humanitarian activity. And what we see is the international humanitarian actions really contextualized by war, such that the focus on water supplies, damming and irrigation is contextualized by conflict resolution and ultimately sort of positioned by a friend and foe political considerations. It's so important that conflict resolution, water has been sort of instilled in conflict resolution type policymaking in Afghanistan, number one. Number two, the transboundary waters have generated a lot of international activity. In the north, a friendship bridge with Uzbekistan over the Oxus River waters and access and transit across it. In the south here, the what is now the India-Afghanistan Friendship Dam. In the west, on the Hadi Rud River near Herat. So more problematically though, the impact of war on the water supply and environment of Afghanistan more generally. Afghanistan has been subject to an international military occupation with multiple bases throughout the country, and bases pollute the environment, all kinds of toxins, from gasoline to armaments. And we have this global problem of military bases. In fact, all around the United States, the toxicity around bases are military bases are a huge problem for the world. And Afghanistan is a really extreme example of that. Much more consequentially, is the impact of depleted uranium in the groundwater from US munitions that have been laced with depleted uranium, beginning with the Tora Bora campaign in December 2001, which was an intensive bombing of eastern Afghanistan that results now in eastern Afghanistan of widespread animal and human birth defects that are not discussed in the international community because of the profound censorship involved in the global war on terror. And we need to take note as conscious global citizens of the incredible criminal abuse of Afghanistan's environment through things like the mother of all bombs, most recently dropped on Afghanistan, full of depleted uranium in the north, affecting the Kabul River Basin and ultimately the Indus River Basin. And the bombing of the Kharez system in the Helmand province has radiated the Helmand province and its groundwater supplies. And this, I suggest, colleagues, is a call to collective action, particularly for United States citizens whose tax dollars are at work in the radiation of Afghanistan's water supply. And I call upon us all to organize and take collective action for remedying some form of compensation, retribution, reparations for this. Afghanistan's waters are now being radiated, rendering the whole environment uninhabitable in the long term. And that's my gravest concern. And I'll end my presentation with that unfortunate conclusion.
Thank you so much, Professor Hanifi, for that sobering presentation. Last but certainly not least, we have another Professor Hanifi. We go from Professor Hanifi the son to Professor Hanifi the father, and that is Professor Jamil Hanifi. He was born and enculturated in Afghanistan. He is a cultural anthropologist with ethnographic research